Well, hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I've entitled this particular podcast Review and Reflection, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Looking back on maybe what you did right, what did you set out to accomplish, and did you improve on some of those things, or what will you still continue to work on? And it's because this is sort of an end of the year show and into the next decade, as I would say. There's lots of motivators out there. People use New Year's resolutions as an opportunity to make changes. And I'm kind of the camp that I say make a change whenever you want to. But just in the spirit of New Year's resolutions, and I kind of like to give you an opportunity to do some review on, in your own life, of some things that you've wanted to take on. So, how do I do this? I got into conversation with some people who I know do these kinds of things. And one of the things that someone described, they used the word rut. And I would change that word and describe that as more of a comfort zone. And I'm going to talk about why it's hard to get out of a comfort zone. And it's because the comfort zone represents stability. Okay, so think about that. I think we've watched people do things in repetition in their life. They get very familiar with it, and they just tend to do it the same way over and over again. And as an outsider, we might look at that and say, wow, why do that? Is that really working for them? Maybe from us on the outside, it isn't. It might seem like there's some shortcomings to their approach to life or to what they're doing. And, I don't know too much about life that's actually perfect. But to us as outsiders, we may see things that person who was there, maybe in the tunnel, maybe tunnel vision, but the person who's out there doing it, they may not see the problems, but they are comfortable with it. And some might use the word rut. I tend to use the word comfort zone. But here's why it's hard to get out of your comfort zone, because comfort zones represent stability. And against the backdrop in life called instability, it's crucial to have stability, because it not only eases the mind, but it gives life a sense of accomplishment. See, think about that. Comfort zones are important because they give you a sense of accomplishment. And you could do it over and over and over, and there's a certain satisfaction with that. So you may find that in your own life that some of these things are very familiar, and it may even be so familiar to you that it's hard to change. It's just ingrained. It's a habit. So if you find that this is something that affects you, think about it. You have geared yourself into the direction of doing something that's, and I'm going to call it comfort zone, something that's very familiar, because it gives you stability. And upsetting that invites the ambiguity into your life. Now, against that backdrop of the ambiguity, it's what creates instability. And that's stressful. I think most of us operate in life in a way that we try to reduce the stress in our lives. That's what exercise is for, is to help reduce the stress. That's what happens with headaches. You gain stress, so you take something for it. Maybe an aspirin. Sometimes we eat because we are stressed. And there's lots of consequences for using that. So there's a number of things that we as individuals embark upon or partake in because of stress. So reducing that as much as we reasonably can then gives us peace. It gives us comfort. And we may find ourselves doing routines which may turn into, and I'm going to use this word in air quotes, it may turn into a rut. But that's how we, in our human behavior, that's how we get there. That's one of the ways in which we get there. It's because it's comfortable. It's less stressful. And we don't change it because of the fact that and think about this, for a lot of people, we know that change is hard. Or actually, the saying is, it's not the changes that's difficult, it's the resisting the change that's difficult. Now, that applies to lots of things. I'm going to leave that on the shelf for the moment. But borrowing that for the illustration here is to point out that changing for a lot of people really brings about instability and discomfort, and it's about them trying to eliminate the instability, which is stressful, you see. And that's important. Being comfortable with who you are, what you're doing. And it's really about the individual themselves and what they feel about the action in the activity. Those of us who are on the outside observing, well, we can have our observation of it, and then if we were to say pick up on that activity, then we might modify it for ourselves. I mean, being that we're not paid to be their coach, then we are merely observers and can take it in and use that advice to fix our own lives as they were. But that would cover the explanation for a lot of people about why they do things the way they do them. It's because it's comfortable, and when it's comfortable, that means there's less stress that creates, and less stress means there's stability, there's peace, there's harmony. And that's very valuable to us as humans. As individuals, we try to achieve that, and we like to do that as inexpensively as possible, meaning not everything we can afford. But we can afford to invest in ourselves, and if we're able to get a modicum of results from the things that we invest our time and effort into, then we embrace it. Now, I'm going to turn that sideways and I'm going to juxtaposition something here. And something we find very, very attractive is people who get out of their comfort zone. For example, a fear that most people have is public speaking. Now, if you are in a group of people and everyone seems to have that hesitation about getting up on stage and speaking in front of a group of people, but then you have that one person that steps out, says, okay, I'm gonna get up in front of this group and I'm gonna make a speech. I'm gonna share a few thoughts. I'm gonna talk. We will admire that person because we all can see that they got out of their comfort zone, and we are watching in real time what's happening, the effect. You can see the look in their eyes, the body language. They may be tensing up, but the fact that they are taking it on in that moment, that makes them, it's energizing. There's charisma in that. They're taking a risk. They're hanging it out there and for all to see. Now, as I was explaining, there are those individuals who want to stay in their comfort zone because it's less stressful, it's peaceful, it's where they're happy at. But that individual who just stepped up on stage and took the risk to hang it out there, that's the one that's really captured our attention. And all the stress and everything that we talked about, it's still there. But after they've gone through that moment of sheer terror, what's on the other side? I'm going to talk about that when I come back. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And I was talking about the comfort zone and how we acquire them, why they're so important to us, and why it's hard to get out of them. But then, given what's more interesting, this is sort of a catalyst to make you think about, okay, you have your comfort zone, and why would you want to get out of it? What's on the other side? And I gave the illustration of one of the biggest fears that people have, which is public speaking. And you have that person that gets up there in front of the group, knowing that they have this fear, and we are watching them speak in front of all of us for the first time. There is that energy that happens. Now, all of us in the room are supporting them because we can all imagine being up there on stage and then having to make this presentation. It's like, who's going to go first? Well, that person that's up there, they're going first. So compare it against everyone else in the room. Now, somebody else may get the courage after this individual, but they're the first one. So you know they're jumping out there. They're way outside of their comfort zone. You can see the energy. You see the fear in their eyes, but they're doing it. Now, we're all mesmerized at the person who will take the risk. We can appreciate the individual who wants to do things and stay in their comfort zone, but we're not really attracted to that so much because the energy is there in the person taking the risk. Now, remember that part I talked about in the first segment about the stress, and we look to avoid situations that cause us stress. Then, and I'm going to give you an illustration of something, how you can begin to gauge good stress and stress that doesn't work out for you so well. Now, the stress that, now, some might say, well, the body processes it just the same. Maybe the body does, but the mind. This is where I'm going to make a distinction for you because there are some stressors that do not bring joy. They bring fear and they bring the kind of terror that paralyzes you. And that stops you from enjoying life. And then there are the examples of like this person who's stepping up on stage and having some sense of themselves, they're going to find some enjoyment out of it. But what really helped this situation, I think it's really the energy in the room. They feel supported. So they're not just hanging it out there because there are those circumstances where you're just hanging it out there and you're in a moment and you have to make a split decision. Yeah, those are stressful things too, life or death. But here's an occasion where the people in the room are supporting you. Yes, it's stressful, but you take it on. And what you experience is that rush of adrenaline. There's a sense of enjoyment. There's the fact that it's happening in real time. And for some people, when they experience these moments, it's surreal. They say time almost slows down for them. It's that they then take in everything that's going on. And it's an amazing feeling to be able to take on your fear that way. Because after you've had the experience, and as that is, let's say this person is speaking, and whether it's off the cuff or reading from a prepared statement, but let's raise the stakes here. Let's just make it that they are just speaking straight off the top, not reading something that's already been edited and prepared, but really having to be in front of the people. And let's say this, they are sharing their vulnerabilities. They're sharing their fears. Now, that's something we can all relate to, but being able to put the words together to talk about the things that you fear. What could you talk about? Hey, in this instance, maybe this person is able to talk about their fear of public speaking. So right in the midst of them doing what they fear the most, they're able to describe how it feels in that moment. And we can all relate to that. Those are opportunities that we can all have in our lives. We have to look for them. Now, the public speaking one is one that I happen to know fairly well. But it's the idea of when you bump up against a limitation how do you get past it? How, in the way of when it's fear that's holding you back, how do you get beyond it? Well, first of all, you want to create an environment that's supportive for you, so that you, on the other side of this, when it's over, and this speaking moment, it will end, whether it's 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, however long it is. And believe it, folks, anytime you are speaking in front of a group of people and it's unscripted, imagine a minute is a very long time. Now, if you have something that you can relate to, something that you're talking about that's really important, something that you're passionate about, you can probably fill the time a lot easier than you can imagine. But let's say somebody else picks the topic and you have to speak on it. That is a challenge. And there can be a lot of fear in taking on something like that. But it's in those moments when you learn a lot about yourself, you learn that you can take a risk and you will be okay at the end. 90% of what we fear never happens. Say that again. 90% of what we fear doesn't happen. We fear that we're going to fail miserably. We're going to fall flat on our face. We're not. And remember how I talked about how the body responds to stressors? It's psychologically, we know it's different. We know it's not life or death, but the way the body thinks, your stomach tightens up. Well, when you get through speaking, you're going to be okay. You're going to be alive. You're not going to die from that. So then you get to put the two together. You get to say, I did that. I survived it. That's what's on the other side of that terror, that fear. That's what's on the other side of it. It's the accomplishment. It's that rush. It's that sense of, wow, I did it. And I've lived to talk about it. That's a catalyst for change. Those kinds of thoughts, think about putting yourself in that place. When you imagine this is what can help you get out of your rut. If you feel like you are in a place and you're stagnant and you want to shake this up a bit, this is how it's done. Pick something you have a connection to, something that you can be passionate about. And we got to do a little bit of visualization here. You're going to have to imagine completing it, having some success. And then on the other side, you get to then experience what success feels like to you. I think so many of us have experienced what I call, and I'm going to just use the word failure. And, it may not be failure, but maybe somebody else called it a failure. You didn't even get a chance to process what happened, but somebody else called it a failure. And that's too bad. Because if we call it a success, maybe it was a learning opportunity, and then we can build on it. I'm going to take a break here. I'm going to come right back and talk about that.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, and I'm talking about stepping out of your comfort zone. So in the example that I gave, I talked about public speaking and how it was that we have a room full of people who have a fear of public speaking, but somebody finally steps out. They're going to be the first one. They step up on stage, and they're doing something that's totally unscripted, and they have to talk for some time. And then the moment has passed. I talked about being in that instance and you as an observer sitting out in the audience watching that person have to figure it out in real time. And they're doing okay. I think we fear those moments because we oftentimes think about, oh, I'm going to look foolish. It's going to be all bad. My nerves are going to get to me. Yes, those things may happen. But remember, I talked about this. This is 90% of what you fear doesn't really happen. In fact, they say the number is higher, but I'm going to work with the 90% thing because I'm pretty confident about that. And I've done a lot of public speaking, and some people are very comfortable with it. Some people talk to themselves all the time, so it's just an extension of that for some individuals. They are that comfortable with it. But let me take you back to something, and I pointed this out. And there's that internal critic that's happening. And how does that internal critic come to exist? Well, I'm going to give you, for some people, the genesis of that. And it's that experience of having something happen and you've not had a chance to process it, but some casual observer, or maybe there's somebody important to you, has already said that you have failed. Now that lands on you. And especially if it's a first time and it's somebody who is important to you, their criticism, their judgment of this is really important. So this is why when you are, let's say you're responsible, let's say you're teaching someone, let's say you're talking to your children, this is why it's important to encourage them and to not look at something as a failure, but look at it as a learning opportunity. Say, okay, well, don't do that. Try this. But that internal critic is born in moments like that. And then we fear that happening repeatedly because the internal critic is not now finding your successes. And this is why it's important to have people around you who support you especially when you're trying to learn something. Because learning in and of itself is a process. And I can talk about that in another podcast. But the learning process in and of itself, there's a building block approach to things. You're generally not going to get it right the first time anyhow. But if you're around people who are highly critical, yes, there could be lots of hesitation in wanting to try something in front of them because the likelihood that it's not going to come out as ideal as one would if they were very rehearsed or very practiced at it, it takes time. But back to that illustration of when somebody else has already rendered an opinion before you've even had a chance to process it. Stuff like that is very stifling to the human spirit. And now some people are able to overcome it for various reasons. And one example is if you've already been through something like that, then you're practiced at being able to shut out the naysayers or the people who would be your detractors. But if you haven't had that opportunity to experience that and then overcome it, then experiences like that then become very familiar. And we carry that internal critic. We carry that voice with us over and over. And we don't just hear it in the voice of the person that said it. Our own voice, our own internal voice begins to take over. And it keeps pounding us with that. It is hard to break through and to have success when you're feeling that internal critic is always there haunting you. So what I want to encourage you to do is write the word critic on a piece of paper. And the next time you are attempting to do something, that's brand new. And I like trying things that are new because this gives you a whole new experience to then have to connect with. Write the word critic, and as you start to feel that you are failing or you're not doing as good as you want to do. Now, we know that you're going to have to stay at this because this is new. Remember, you had to crawl before you could walk. I want you to tear up that critic. Tear up that page that says critic. Put it away. This is symbolic, but it's very important. And it's how you have to begin to silence those things which would take away, that is, would keep you from having success. You have to silence those voices. And in the experience of living your life, that critic that's in your head is with you all the time. And it is hard to beat that down. Like I said, it began as the voice of someone else who was observing you. And if it could stay that voice, you could probably be able to just shut that person out. But when that voice becomes your own, that is a very difficult voice to silence. So the question becomes, why do we take on these things? It's because when we have success, we feel good about ourselves. And that experience of being in familiar territory, all the while it is comforting, there are times when that feels as though it's overdone and you want to sense change. And you know, lots of things human beings want is they like change. They can appreciate change. Sometimes we don't want to go out and get it, but the way we can experience that in ourselves is to go after it, is to pursue it. Now, remember our friend who was doing the public speaking. Remember the first one. The first one up is the one who is taking the huge risk because he's in front of everybody. He or she, they're in front of everybody making their presentation straight off the top, unscripted, and you're going to be fine. You're going to survive it. Again, what's key here is doing it around people who support you. If there are going to be people around, you do it around people that support you. Because that thing about the critic, that naysayer, we don't want to let that voice in the room, because if that voice shows up, we're going to get stopped. We're going to feel embarrassed. We're going to feel humiliation. We're going to feel all of those things that happen when people criticize us. What I want for you is to have the critic out of the room, and I want you to feel the love and the enthusiasm you have for yourself for taking on something new. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Thank you for listening.